This is the audio recording of Floyd James Thompson, America's longest prisoner of war. In this episode, I'll be exploring the life of Floyd James Thompson, or Jim. He was a retired colonel in the United States Army. Thompson was the longest held prisoner of war, or POW, in American history. He was held from 1964 to 1973, nearly 9 years in captivity. The reason I found Jim's story so interesting initially was because I'd never heard of him. I'm no official historian or any authority on history, really. Just somebody who occupies a lot of his time with readings on history, podcasts on history, and the sort. But I didn't really take much interest in Vietnam until much later in life, in my early 30s probably. It was generally World War I, World War II, or somewhere in Asia. And sprinkling of American Revolution here or there, or some sort of Mongols, just something that really held the interest. Even so, at some point you would think that the longest held prisoner of war would have come up on my radar, but here we are. Initially I heard it on a Jocko podcast. I believe he was just mentioned when he one of the many POWs from Vietnam that Jocko's had on. And so I went to his Wikipedia page, and he had a really tragic life, and that's kind of what perked my curiosity. And so that's why we're here now. We'll be exploring his life in brief detail. Before Vietnam, Thompson was born in July 8th, 1933, in Bergenfield, New Jersey, to the son of a bus driver. He was drafted in June 14th, 1956, and although there was no active war in 1956, they still needed somebody to paint rocks and sweep dirt in the motor pool, so they enlisted Jim's help. But at first, he was kind of rebellious, which is understandable for a young man being drafted, to be taken out of your life and thrown to the military machine and remolded into a soldier. You either take to it swimmingly, or you buck against it, or you find a way to work within it. But after a while, this dissipated because Thompson at some point decided to make a career out of the military. So Thompson goes on later to attend Officer Candidate School, or OCS. And then while serving stateside, he was recruited into Special Forces as a Green Beret. The reason he was recruited as a Green Beret was because the Green Berets have a hard time keeping officers, generally. It's just like a box checking for most officers, like, I'm here, check, move on to my next assignment. I got that on my resume, and so I'm going to go on to do bigger and better things that don't get you killed as quickly, I guess, as Green Berets do. And from there, he went on to Ranger School, followed by Jump School. And then after that, he goes on to be an instructor. And he was an instructor from 1958 to 1960. He was an infantry instructor at Fort Benning, Georgia. And from there he spent about a year in South Korea as a platoon commander, 2nd Brigade, 34th Infantry Regiment. So 1960 to 1961, Korea. And then he served as a re-enlistment officer with the headquarters at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and that went on to 1962. So he hasn't yet hit Vietnam. Pretty normal career for anybody who got drafted. That's pretty cush if you're getting drafted. Although Korea wasn't as easy as assignment as it is today, still, once you see what Vietnam is like later on, Korea just looked like a vacation. So, 1962, Vietnam. Originally, Thompson was assigned to go to the Congo. He was learning Lingala, which is a language common to the people in the northern portion of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And but then, shortly after this, Vietnam really starts to pick up. So his team was pulled from their assignment to go to Congo and then sent to Vietnam. Thompson left for Vietnam at the end of December 1963. And when he left behind Alice, his wife of 9 years, and he left their 3 daughters, Pam, who was 6, Laura was 4, and Ruth was 3. And while stationed in Vietnam, he was the commander of a team responsible for resupplying various parts of Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now the trail, just to paint a picture here, if you're not going to Google it and look it up, which would probably be the best thing to do, or insert a picture. The trail is less of a trail. It's more of a series of routes that would run between Laos and Cambodia along the border of Vietnam. So Vietnam is a coastal country, and China's in the northernmost portion, and then the northwest you have Laos. Laos itself runs along the western border till about the Central Highlands, or Dak To. And for reference, Dak To is, pretty much directly west of My Lai, and if that sounds familiar to you, it should be the My Lai massacre that happened there. And from that point in Dak To begins Cambodia, which meanders along the southern border to the hook of Vietnam until about the South China Sea. So that trail ran the length of both of those two countries, and Vietnam to its east, and then the Gulf of Tonkin over there in the South China Sea. And so the trail really was just between those two countries, with Laos, Cambodia, and then Vietnam, and it kind of ran along the center. But Laos was officially neutral, but the Laotian people in this region, it's not like a big homogenous group of people that all believe the same thing. It's not even like America, where you can go, we got Democrats, we got Republicans, and so they would have found a bunch of sympathizers who associated with one group. No, more than likely they were just rural people or mountain people, or so they just see some North Vietnamese people moving supplies. You don't really think much of it. But Cambodia was neutral. But these two countries, you kind of get like a pseudo blessing to run supplies through there, and not like there's not a lot of people watching these routes, so it really wasn't their main supply route. The main artery was these trails that ran along these two borders, and Americans by and large weren't allowed to just run into these areas and run roughshod and shoot up obviously the Saga guys, Studies and Observation Group guys, and the Green Berets, they did all kinds of work in these countries, but that's unofficial. We didn't find this out till years later when it was declassified. But so the trail between these two countries is what makes North Vietnamese army resupply possible all throughout Vietnam. And with these two pseudo blessings, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was capable of being just a very vital supply route for the NVA. And most of the anywhere in Vietnam where they needed supplies, generally it came from these trails. It's an oversimplification, but I'm painting with broad strokes here. So there's a really great book by Tom Philpott on Thompson's life. And this is from an interview where he was plugging the book on C-SPAN. And so this is from the author Philpott. Quote, "When Jim first arrived, it was a very remote outpost, quite a dangerous assignment, and his 12-man team was there to train work with the Nungs, who were sort of the special forces from China, to work with the Montagnards, who were the native population there, and to work with the South Vietnamese regular forces." End quote. I've heard it Montagnards. I guess the French, whenever you hear it from the Saga guys, they call them Montagnards, but that's a quote. So he's explaining the differences. He never really explains the differences between these groups because he's focusing on Jim's life, but the key takeaway here is these groups didn't get along. You know, like the Chinese Nungs didn't like the Montagnards. The Montagnards didn't like the Chinese Nungs or the Vietnamese. And nobody liked the Montagnards except the Americans who worked with them directly. Because the Montagnards were essentially local tribal people. I mean, they were local tribal people to the Vietnamese, so they were definitely local tribal people to anybody else who would come in, you know, like the Chinese Nungs. But Jim, you know, that's a dangerous assignment. You're working with 3 different groups of people who don't really like each other. And then on top of that, they're supposed to like the Americans, or work with the Americans, better yet. And so that you get there, and it's not the easiest assignment. You've never really had a real assignment dealing with any kind of, let's say, not so friendlies, for lack of a better term at the moment. Like I said, though, the studies and observation guys, Saga guys, they really liked working with the Montagnards, and they believed they were really tough warriors. And the Chinese Nungs were also very tough warriors, and they would, you know, give as good as they got in a fight and could be relied upon. Captured. The Special Forces base of operation was in Quang Tri. An Air Force L-19 observation plane, which was, think of a Cessna, so about 25 feet in length, about a height of 7 feet, and a maximum speed of 51 miles an hour. So a small craft. And this craft would periodically drop off payroll at the base, and if the pilot, Captain Richard Whitesides, if he had extra fuel, one of the NCOs at Thompson's camp, he'd fly on board and check out activity in the area, see what's going on from the air, just get a little assessment of the terrain. And the sergeant that would normally do this, he was on R&R near Nha Trang, off on the coast, and so Jim took it upon himself to fly in the co-pilot seat that day. Well, during the flight, a bridge was spotted. Looked to be a freshly constructed bridge, so they probably had destroyed it recently, or it had been destroyed recently. And Jim asked Captain Whitesides to fly down and take a closer look. Well, this was below flight minimums, and flight minimums were there for a reason. You know, small arms fire is only effective to a certain point. And so when he flew below flight minimums, which was about 1,000 feet, they started taking heavy small arms fire, and that's when their plane took on so much small arms fire that it got shot out of the sky. And this is when they believe Captain Whiteside was killed. They believe he was killed by small arms fire. Jim didn't know either way. He was thrown from the crash, or the plane before it crashed. And he had several burn wounds and cuts and scrapes on his legs. But the big boo-boo that Jim had was his back was broken. You know, you getting thrown out of a plane, you're going to break some things. Jim broke his back. And he had broken back, burns on his legs, open wounds. And so he's not really conscious, and he's quickly captured by the North Vietnamese who shot him down. So he's shot down, captured, Whiteside's dead, and for the next 4 years, he's spent being moved in and out of jungle camps in South Vietnam. Oh, and this place where he was shot down, I looked it up. They had a spot on Google, or I can't remember if it was Wikipedia or if it was like his prisoner of war page. But either way, they had it on there where they believed it was. And it was about 20 kilometers west of Quang Tri. So just think Khe Sanh, you hear about that one a lot in the movies. It was near the DMZ. It was near there. During these first 4 years, Jim was kept in isolation from other prisoners. One of the punishments he faced was to be kept in a bamboo cage. It was about 2 feet wide, 2 feet high, and about 5 feet in length. And he'd spend the next 4 months lying on his side with the broken back, with his wounds. They didn't give him really any medical attention. He's just in this small little bamboo cage on his side. And after this 4-month stint, Jim was upgraded to a luxurious cage of about 3 feet wide, 6 feet in length, far roomier. It deserves stressing again. This is all in solitary confinement, essentially. He has the odd guard here and there, but they don't really, they're not really talking to you. They're not shooting the stuff with you. They're not. But you're in captivity. You're a prisoner, and you're by yourself. And so in July of 1967, the Viet Cong started walking Thompson blindfolded along the journey up to the Ho Chi Minh Trail towards North Vietnam. Again, kept in isolation, and upon reaching what was his 8th POW camp along the trail, his Viet Cong interrogators escalated their torture. They wanted him to sign a statement proving that the United States' involvement in Vietnam was criminal. And when he refused, his guards beat him with bamboo sticks. They choked him, hung him up by his thumbs. The more infamous form of torture utilized by the Viet Cong was as follows. This is from Thompson. Quote, "The guard tied my elbows behind my back until they touched. It couldn't be done unless extreme force is applied. They attached a rope to my elbows and threw it over a ceiling beam and hoisted me up. This forced my arms back even further, causing excruciating pain on my breastbone. I felt my chest would split open. Thankfully, I contracted dysentery and was extremely weak. Every time they tortured me, I'd pass out." End quote. Gotta love dysentery. Another soldier that was later released with Thompson, Don McPhail, Don McPhail suffered one of those kinds of tortures that if it was in a movie, you'd be like, oh, that's a little extreme. That's a little over the top. So, this is from Philpott, the author of Jim's book, the book about Jim, from Philpott. Quote, "Jim came back with Don McPhail, another Special Forces soldier who was held for a time in the South. And it does sort of indicate to you, I hope, what extreme conditions they went through. But Don was captured with other Special Forces. I think now all of them had died. The guys that, let's break here, the guys that he was with his force that he was with, Don McPhail, they'd all been killed. And somehow Don McPhail was taken alive." Continuing with quote. "But he was held in brutal captivity. He was, I think, 5 years. But at one point, the Viet Cong had pulled out all of his toenails and fingernails." End quote. His captors went on to club at his hands and feet, clubbing at the raw and exposed bits of flesh. That's just one hell of a form of torture. And this was all mostly just to get them to sign documents, admitting to stuff like, I'm a trespasser in this land. I shouldn't be here. American involvement is criminal. Which what are you gonna do with that? I'd never. The British did this a lot, where they would come into an area, and they would have authority to do something because they pretty much own the area, the territory that they're in, but they would feel a need to cite the law or rule they were violating, destroy the area and then bill them for it. And you're just kind of like, why bill them? Just take everything they own. But it's these weird little things in war that just don't make 100% sense to you, but they felt the need to do it, and so they felt the need to torture this guy to get him to sign. And more than likely, that wasn't why they did what they did to him. I bet if he was a Special Forces guy, he took a lot of their guys with him, and they were probably just torturing this guy to torture him. Another soldier, excuse me, another soldier, not with Jim, but just to illustrate the kind of environment that Thompson was living in. And this is from a Times article where I was just, after I saw the last bit of torture, when I read that, I was like, well, what? I mean, how common was this? And it turns out, if it was common, the guys didn't live, but they lived long enough to tell it. But it led on to some other forms of torture that were illuminating, to say the very least. And this soldier, he was suffering from dysentery and was being denied any kind of medical aid for this ailment. And he was buried up to his neck, and for days on end, he was left there until he ended up suffocating on his own excrement. Now, the Times article doesn't go on to tell how this would happen. We're just left to believe it. But this just, it's the kind of torture you see here is the kind of torture you can get when you're only limited by your imagination and the implements at hand. And so you have a bunch of North Vietnam conscripts or believers or prisoners who were taken and forced into the army of the North Vietnamese. And these guys, maybe they saw you kill a lot of their buddies personally. Maybe they saw too many of their friends die in strikes, bomb strikes, B-52 strikes, whatever it is. And they would take it out. They would take it out on the people who were captured. The Vietnamese government does deny torturing POWs. And even soldiers who would return to Vietnam later for like those trips where you get to see the real heartwarming tale about how the guy who was in Vietnam, there's like 12 of these guys, and they go back and they're riding mopeds around and seeing what this country looks like now. The government fully denies torturing American GIs. They said they were treated well in prisons. And if you go and talk to local Vietnamese, which I doubt this will ever make it to Vietnam, but if you talk to most average school people who went to local schools, they would probably tell you the same thing, because that's just what they were told. Just like most of us never heard about My Lai. I never heard about that in school. Nobody ever came up to me and was like, hey, have you heard of the Sand Creek Massacre? And you're like, no. It's like, have you heard of My Lai? No. Have you heard about what happened to those people in Waco? No. It's like they just don't tell you some of these things, so you can't really blame the North Vietnamese government for doing the exact same thing. Another underrated form of torture is sleep deprivation. Hell, you can do that to somebody I've heard of people, I know people who've been in abusive relationships, and sleep deprivation was used against them. It's a very effective form of torture, especially if you're a POW and you're not getting food, and so they don't let you eat. You can't sleep. You can't really do anything. They're just trying to keep you off guard. Trying to keep your mind weak, vulnerable, and susceptible to coercion. Another form of torture, although this is more understandable, was food. Control of food. The diet was very limited. Barest of minimums. Watery soup with the odd fish heads, some green sprouts in it. Bread consisting of, if you're lucky, worms. Obviously sand was in there as filler. This was for practical reasons, more than anything. The supplies, you just didn't really have supplies, and if you did have it, you were going to give it to, it trickled down. The guys at the top got the best, and then it trickled down to the guys down at the bottom, and then the common soldiers got what they got, and then you got what was left, if anything. So Jim, at this point, we're several years in captivity. He's his 8th POW camp. They've moved him out of that tiny ass little cage. He was taken out of that and put into like a regular size, small, like regular. I mean, what are we talking about here? A prison. It wasn't a cage. It was a cage, but it was like, you couldn't really stand up in it, but he was there. It was bigger than the one where he had to like just lay on his side. And Jim, when he got to Korea, when he got to Vietnam, he was about a buck 80, 180 pound, if you will. And when he returned, he was less than 100 pounds. I'd say he was about at mid 90 pounds. And so he's been in captivity for quite some time now. And the war is starting to draw to a close. And food starts to slightly improve. And about October 1969, treatment of prisoners improved. And the credit of this change, well, I mean, there are all kind of factors that work towards it. But there was a lot of the world attention, well, America's attention focused on the plight of the POWs. And this kind of embarrassment pressured the Politburo in Hanoi to have passed the word down to take it just a little bit easier on some of these prisoners. And the important part for Jim was they were allowed to exercise. And that ended up helping Jim greatly. And it was the introduction of a gentleman by the name of Lou Meyer. Meyer was a contractor and a veteran himself. He was an assistant fire chief working in Da Nang when he was captured. So they were like, he's fire suppression guy, or just a guy working for the fire suppression units out in Da Nang. And he was a big believer in physical fitness, staying in shape. And so he would get out and do PT in the morning, physical training. And when Jim saw this, he was just like, oh yeah, I forgot all about physical training. It was just something that he was remembering it from back in his days and in the army. And so he goes to try and do a push-up, and he just falls flat on his face. He can't do it. He had the broken back, severe wounds, dysentery on multiple occasions, malnourished. He was beaten. He had his arms twisted and manipulated in ways that if they were to do it, if they were to do one of those things to you, it would be understandable if you didn't feel like doing push-ups, or if you couldn't really do push-ups. But Meyer, being the gentleman that he was, Meyer ended up taking Jim on, essentially, and working at Jim's pace. And that really helped build Jim back up a little bit. Just going at his pace. And then when Meyer was done, because that's not enough, he would work out at night. Once he's done working with Jim, he goes and works out on his own. And that's really, it's a good person. Lou Meyer could have just thought about himself. He wasn't in the military anymore. He was a veteran working. He was attached to a base that was overrun, essentially, and taken prisoner as a civilian. And so he takes it upon himself to help Jim get back up and running the best he can. I'll mention this. It does bear mentioning. Jim made 5 separate escape attempts. This is from Philpott. The first 3 escapes came early, after he was able to build himself back up a little bit to walk. To walk for a time. He was moved from camp to camp on a stretcher, but eventually he was able to walk, to shuffle, and he would shuffle away from camp, hoping to get all the way away. And for 3 of these attempts, he would just run into a guard. He would tell the guard that he was looking to relieve himself, and they would head back to camp, end quote. So these attempts, although they were admirable and understandable, the jungle terrain of Vietnam would be a challenge for even a healthy person. let alone somebody who was in such a state of disarray as Jim. Plus, Jim had no real knowledge, just a total ignorance of the landscape, absolutely ignorant on the language, and the weather, the animals that were in the jungle, the diseases, the monsoon season that could run through. It just, so many things working against him. And then on top of all that, you stand out. You're a white guy walking through Vietnam, or shuffling at this point, shuffling through Vietnam. And so if some local sees you, all he sees, he doesn't see Jim Thompson, America's longest held prisoner of war. He doesn't see an American soldier who looks like he's just there because his country drafted him back in, the early days before the war. He sees a guy. He sees a possible invader. He sees a payday from the North Viet Cong. He sees an enemy. He sees all kinds of things. So you make it past all those other things and avoiding detection of people and avoiding all those elements. Then you would have to start making your way to a base. And he had no idea where he was. No map. So they're admirable attempts, and I'm glad to hear that people did them. There's actually a whole PDF, which I might put in the notes, of people who made escape attempts and who actually did escape. And maybe that's worth exploring in the future. But Jim wasn't going to get far. He really wasn't. So let's say for argument's sake, you're World War I, World War II. You're a white guy. You're escaping through a European country. You look like the people there. You, by and large, you look like them. The language, you don't speak it, but you might be able to tell Italian from French. You might be able to tell that. And you definitely, at this point, know German. Or not know German, but you understand German as opposed to French or as opposed to Polish. I don't even know what Polish sounds like. But I bet if I heard somebody speaking German and Polish, I'd be able to tell the difference on which one they're speaking. But if you give me an American in the 60s, and you give him Chinese and Vietnamese, or you give him two different dialects of Vietnamese, they don't know the difference. He's not going to know the difference. So, and then in Europe, it would be far more understandable. There's not a bunch of mountain ranges. There's not a monsoon season that comes through. There's not tigers. There was tigers in these these Vietnamese jungles. So, like I said, admirable, totally admirable, but it probably wasn't going to happen. You probably don't. But the movie Apocalypse Now, there's a scene in it where it's Martin Sheen's character, Captain Willard, and the character, I don't know his name, but nobody else does, played Chef. They get off the boat, going to look for mangoes, because Chef wants some mangoes. And then while they're out there, Sheen's kind of like spooked, or his character, Captain Will, is kind of spooked by something, doesn't know what it is, and it turns out to be a tiger. And they're like shooting at nothing because they're fleeing from the tiger. And they run back to the boat, and Chef's screaming like the whole way back, and as they're motoring off down the river, never get out of the boat, screaming it. Never get out of the boat. And he's right. If you can avoid getting out of a boat in the jungles of Vietnam, don't get out of the boat. You're just going to get yourself killed. His release and return. Thompson was released as part of Operation Homecoming, and this took place from February 12th, 1973 to April 4th, 1973. So he was captured on March 26, 1964. And he was released on March 16th, 1973. So that's 10 days short of 9 years. The years after his release, This is where it starts this is where it starts to get sad. Because up until now it was unfortunate. Up until now it was very, very unfortunate. So his wife Alice and their 4 children, his daughters were 6, 5, and 4 years of age when their father was captured. Three of these kids didn't even recall who their father was. They were led to believe by their mom, who the woman that she remarried was their father. And the mother had... So one of the oldest daughter, Pam, actually had memory of her father. She had a photo of him that her mother allowed her to keep, but made her keep it out of sight from the other children. The second daughter, Laura, had some vague memory of her father, but when she inquired to her mom about this, her mother told her that her real father had died of a snake bite. Ruth, no memory of her father, and then his son, that's right, he had a son, Jim Jr., was born the day after his father's capture. So, never knew his father whatsoever, still inside when he was in Vietnam. And it's upon his arrival stateside, Jim, like we said, less than 100 pounds. And this is from Philpott. This is the morning that he gets to Valley Forge Army Hospital. He gets released, and this is the first seeings of his family. From Philpott, quote, "On the morning of March 20th, 1973, one wing of Valley Forge Army Hospital, Pennsylvania, began to crackle with excitement. A small crowd gathered expectantly in the hallways as word spread. In his 2-room suite, Jim Thompson donned his green beret at the proper rockish angle and walked with Alice and the escort officers down the corridor through the double glass doors and outside into the crisp morning air. Though terribly thin and pale, and sporting deep circles under his eyes, Thompson wore a broad smile as he waited at the top of the cement ramp. Medical staff and fellow patients pressed against every available window to glimpse a scene that would burn in the memory for a lifetime. America's longest-held POW was about to meet his daughters for the first time in 9 years, and to hold a son he had never seen. Suddenly, the children rounded the corner and turned into the sunshine. The girls had grown from golden-haired toddlers to teenage brunettes. The only towhead among them then suddenly bolted from his sisters and ran up the ramp. 'Jimmy!' exclaimed. The boy leapt into his father's arms and knocked the skinny soldier to the pavement. They sat there hugging each other as Pamela, Laura, and Ruth piled on. At that moment, Alice says she decided to return to Jim if he would have her, so the children would know their father." End quote. Pam made the choice to leave the man she was married to. I believe Philpott calls him Harold. He didn't want his name released. When Philpott wrote the book, he didn't want his name released. Get into him in a minute. But for Jim, this was the start of another journey into sadness. Before the summer of 1974, the marriage had fallen apart. In 1975, the couple filed for divorce less than 15 months after his return to the States. Alice told author Tom Philpott that she believed prison had affected her husband's mind. She said he had suffered from nightmares and he was abusive towards both her and the children. Thompson had also begun to drink in heavy excess and was battling depression. It's understandable. Thompson never really developed a truly lasting relationship with any of his children. Just a little bit on Thompson's depression. It's 100% understandable that even nowadays, if he were to come back from war, nowadays they have more of a protocol to sit down and talk with you and kind of get an assessment of what's going on and try and see if they can't get something worked out or talk to a shrink or something, but I just don't know. I just don't know what they could have done for this man. I just don't know where you would have started with this guy. But the wrong place to start is where Thompson started. He began drinking in heavy excess. He started abusing pills. The only lasting relationship he really had with his children may have been Ruth, but Alice went on to remarry, and by 1977, Thompson's second marriage had already failed. In that same year, Thompson attempted suicide in the form of an overdose on alcohol and pills. His superiors told author Tom Philpott that had it not been for his status as a POW, that Thompson would have been discharged from the service for his alcoholism alone. Although Thompson was promoted to lieutenant colonel upon release and then to full colonel, he had missed the most important years of his military career while in prison. He had no formal military education beyond OCS. He lacked even a college degree or experience as a company commander, or true experience as a company commander. This is a sidebar, and it could be taken as a joke, but I mean, he had a lot of experience with prison. Why not put him in charge of Fort Leavenworth or something? Or, I don't know. Maybe it's a crude attempt at a joke, but hell, who else would know better? So in 1981, while still on active duty, Thompson suffered a massive heart attack and a severe stroke. He was in a coma for months and was left seriously disabled. He was paralyzed on one side and could speak only in brief phrases for the rest of his life. On January 28, 1982, due to his deteriorating health, Thompson was forced to retire from the Army. So I don't go into much depth on the children. Jim Jr. had legal troubles. He murdered a man in 1990. It was one of those, like, do something, what are you going to do about it? I'll kill you, yeah, sure, and then he comes back and actually kills the guy. Jim thought that his absence is kind of what led to the boy being so unmanageable. Who knows? Jim wasn't manageable himself, so what were you going to do? But I guess I see what he's saying. If he wouldn't have been in prison, yeah, well. And the girls, Thompson didn't fare much better. Ruth had some in and out relationship. She truly did love her father. But after Jim's stroke, he took almost everything, any perceived thing, as a personal slight. So on occasion, I guess, Ruth would send flowers to her father for Christmas. And she did this for years at this point. But on this one occasion, she forgot to add her name onto the card. And it just read from, the husband and kids, whatever their names were. Jim worried that something had happened to Ruth. Perhaps she was injured. Perhaps they were going through a divorce. Something, what was it? Why didn't she put her name on it? And so he calls the house. Ruth's husband answers, explained that all is well. She just simply forgot, Jim, and she'll call you back. Well, she must have forgot. Life has a way of making that happen. She forgot for a couple of days, and by the time she called him back, that was enough for Jim not to talk to her for about a year. So, it's just, that's what you're working with. And Thompson remained active in the veteran. That's really his relationship with his kids. Philpott does a better job of exploring all of this in detail, but there really wasn't much of a relationship there with the kids. So Thompson, still active in the veterans community, in particular the POW community. And on July 8th, 2002, at the staff of the Joint Interagency Task Force, East Division, some of him and his close friends threw that committee and threw Thompson a birthday party. He was described at the birthday party to be in high spirits. During the celebration, he quoted General Douglas MacArthur, who said, quote, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," end quote. And 8 days later, July 16th, 2002, Thompson was found dead in his Key West condominium. He was dead, age of 86. And he was cremated, and his ashes were spread off the Florida coast. Who knows if that's what he wanted, but we assume so. I mean, definitely didn't want to send him back to Vietnam. But there's a memorial marker at the Anderson National Cemetery if anybody wants to go be depressed. But the life of James Floyd Thompson it's frankly tragic. He started from humble beginnings, went into a marriage that on the surface could have weathered a great deal had he not been absent for 9 years in a POW hellhole. The strain on his body and his mind probably would have killed a lesser man. It probably would have killed me, you know. But he endured. And the real kicker on this, he wasn't even supposed to be on that flight that day. You know, the NCO that would have been on that flight more than likely would have not. He would have known better than to go below flight minimums. Not casting blame here. But and James, he probably never would have been shot down. He probably never would have been captured because he was an officer, you know. Most officers didn't get in that position to be captured. Especially if you were in Jim's position. But he flew too low, and had he not, his life would have been completely different. I don't go into Alice's story much here. Alice had fallen through the cracks of the military support system. You see, people rotate in and out of the military with great frequency. And so any support Alice had initially, you know, husbands that may have been captured, that had formed a tight community in that area, wives of the husbands, that had been captured, that maybe they had formed a tight-knit community, they would have rotated out, gotten news their husbands had died, and moved on to someplace different. Or, you know, Alice really the longest held POW. And so she, you know, no word, no hope, remarries, understandable, and all of your support's gone. She had not the best upbringing, and being alone with 4 children and being the sole provider is a frightening prospect. Philpott goes into much better, much more thorough definition or defining of her life and getting her actual feelings on it. And I really recommend that book because I can only imagine what she was going through at the time. And you best reserve judgment on her until after you've read the book. She really was in not a great spot. And I do feel great sympathy for her. I really do. I don't see eye to eye on a lot of her decisions. Obviously, I don't know what it's like to be a single mother raising children. But I do feel telling one of your children that their father died from a snake bite when he was, you know, a prisoner of war, I don't think that helps. I don't know what I would have done. I think the truth is often the best thing. But I don't feel like that story made things better for the children. Hell, if anything, it just made them afraid of snakes. So in conclusion, the tragic life of Floyd James Thompson is really just everything that could go wrong for him went wrong, and war completely affected him. It affected his mental health, his physical health. His attempts to escape reality were completely understandable, you know. And his remaining years of military career were not the best. You know, at some point they decided to make a degree a requirement for officers, and Jim didn't have one. You know, you can't get one in prison, at least in the Vietnam prisons that I'm aware of. And so he has little experience, little leadership roles, and his alcoholism alone would have been grounds for discharge in most other times in the military history. And so they really kept him around as long as they could and did the best, well, did what they wanted to with him. And so, that's probably commendable, but there really isn't much that man could have done or was willing to do. Some end notes. I'm unsure of the exact location of where he was shot down. The coordinates are on Thompson's Wikipedia page if you're interested in looking them up. The man who Alice remarries, he didn't desire his real name to be published, as I said, and so Philpott's book, he's called Harold. And after Jim's return, this man seems to fade away from Alice and the children's lives. They never really see him again. He never really comes back. He goes on to remarry and, have a family of his own, but he never comes back into those children's lives. Tom Philpott is alive as of this recording in 2023. You should definitely check out his book, Glory Denied, the Saga of Jim Thompson, America's Longest Held Prisoner of War. I didn't find it on Audible, but it's definitely available on Amazon or your local bookseller. There is an opera about Tom Philpott's book on Jim's life. I didn't check it out. It was just something I came across while doing research. It looks about as interesting as an opera can look. And an end note, if you don't know about the My Lai Massacre, or you don't know about Sand Creek or Waco, I highly suggest you check out the Martyr Made podcast with Daryl Cooper. Daryl does a fantastic job of exploring the mindset of men going into these situations that lead to events such as My Lai. Warning, it's not for the faint of heart. It's a hard episode to get through, but it's very informative. Daryl Cooper at the Martyr Made podcast. It's episode 10, Anything That Moves. Thank you very much. And enjoy your evening.